Our story number 2, the hiker who found a tent that wasn't on any map. My name is Evan, and before this happened, I was the kind of person who preferred hiking alone. I know that sounds strange after everything I'm about to tell you, but I genuinely liked being by myself in the wilderness. There was something about getting away from roads, traffic, phones, and people that made me feel calmer. When I was out hiking, I didn't have to think about work or school or bills or anything else. Just the trail, just the next mile. I had been hiking for years, and I consider myself pretty experienced. I carried a paper map, even when I had GPS. I kept extra water in my pack. I told people where I was going, and I never intentionally went off trail. That last part is important, because the day this happened, I didn't realize I'd left the trail until it was already too late. It happened in early September. I was visiting a large national park in the western United States, and I'd planned a solo day hike that was supposed to take about 6 hours. The weather was perfect. Cool morning air, clear skies, and just enough clouds to keep the sun from becoming unbearable. I started hiking around 8 o'clock in the morning. For the first few hours, everything went exactly as planned. The trail climbed through pine forest before opening up along a rocky ridge. I stopped there for lunch, took a few pictures, and checked my map. I still had plenty of daylight, so I continued. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, I reached a section of trail where things became confusing. There had been a recent storm, and several trees had fallen across the path. The actual trail disappeared beneath branches and leaves. I looked around for trail markers, but couldn't see any. I walked back about 50 yards. Nothing. Then I noticed what looked like another trail heading downhill. It wasn't marked on my map, but it was clearly a path. Not a major trail, just a narrow dirt track through the trees. I assumed it was an old maintenance route, or maybe a temporary detour created by park workers. I thought I could follow it for a few minutes and reconnect with the main trail. That was my mistake. I walked downhill. At first, the path was easy to follow. Then it narrowed. The trees became thicker. The forest grew strangely quiet. I checked my GPS. According to the map, I was only a few hundred yards away from the official trail. So I kept going. Another 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The GPS showed me moving farther away from the trail instead of closer. I stopped. That was when I realized something. I couldn't hear anything. No hikers, no birds, not even wind. It was one of those moments where you suddenly become aware of how completely alone you are. I pulled out my paper map. The trail I was standing on wasn't there. Not even close. I decided to turn around. I had taken maybe 5 steps when I noticed something between the trees. At first, I thought it was a large rock. Then I realized it was a tent, an old green tent. It was partially hidden beneath the trees, maybe 30 yards away. I remember thinking, what the hell is that doing here? I checked my map again. There was no campsite marked anywhere near that location. I knew there were designated backcountry campsites in other areas of the park, but this wasn't one of them. Still, I was curious. I walked toward it. The tent looked old from the outside. The fabric was faded. There were leaves stuck to the sides. One of the guy lines had fallen loose. But then I noticed something strange. The tent wasn't abandoned. There was a small cooking setup beside it. A metal pot sat over a portable stove, and there was food, fresh food. I could smell it before I even reached the campsite. Something like soup. I stopped. The stove was still warm. I could see steam coming from a pot. Someone had been there recently. Very recently. I looked around. Hello. Nothing. I called again. Hey, anyone here? No answer. I didn't like the feeling I was getting. I should have turned around immediately. Instead, I stepped closer. There was a backpack beside the tent. It looked new. A pair of hiking boots sat outside. There was a water bottle, a jacket, a small flashlight, everything someone would need for an overnight trip. But there was no person. I waited. Maybe they'd gone to collect firewood. Maybe they were somewhere nearby. I stood there for a few minutes. Then I heard a branch snap behind me. I turned around. Nothing. Just trees. I stared into the forest. Hello. No response. I picked up my backpack. I was ready to leave. Then I noticed something on the ground beside the tent. A phone. It was lying face down in the dirt. I picked it up. The screen was cracked, but it was still on. There was no signal. I pressed the power button. The lock screen showed a photograph. A man standing beside the same tent. I looked at the picture. Then I looked at the tent. The man in the photograph was wearing the exact same jacket that was lying beside the tent. I immediately put the phone down. Something was very wrong. I turned around and started walking. I didn't run. Not yet. I just wanted to get back to the trail. After about a minute, I heard footsteps behind me. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I turned around. Nothing. I waited. Nothing. I continued walking. A few seconds later, crunch, crunch, crunch. I stopped again. This time I was certain. Someone was following me. I pulled out my phone. Still no signal. I checked the GPS. The screen showed that I was much farther from the main trail than I thought. Nearly 2 miles. I had somehow walked almost 2 miles into the forest without realizing it. I started moving faster. The footsteps continued behind me. They were never close enough for me to see anyone, but they were always there. Whenever I stopped, they stopped. Whenever I walked, they walked. I tried to convince myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe a bear, but the footsteps sounded too deliberate. They followed the same direction I was going. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop. A voice. A man's voice. Very quiet. Hey. I turned around. Nobody. I shouted, "Who's there?" Silence. Then, wait. I didn't answer. I kept walking. The voice came again. Wait. This time it sounded closer. I started running. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. Branches hit my face. My backpack bounced against my shoulders. I kept checking behind me. Nothing, but I could still hear someone running through the trees. I ran until I reached a steep slope. I nearly fell. I grabbed a tree to steady myself. Then I realized I recognized the area. There was a large fallen tree with a distinctive split trunk. I'd passed it earlier. That meant I was going in circles. I looked at my GPS. The blue arrow was spinning. The device couldn't establish my direction properly. My phone was useless. I was completely lost. Then I heard the voice again. This time, it came from somewhere directly behind me. "You're going the wrong way." I froze. Those words didn't sound threatening. That's what made them worse. They sounded almost helpful. I turned around slowly. About 50 feet away, between 2 trees, I saw a man. He was standing perfectly still. He was wearing a dark jacket. I couldn't see his face clearly. I shouted, "Who are you?" He didn't answer. I asked if he was the person from the campsite. Still nothing. Then he took 1 step toward me. I took a step backward. He stopped. I turned and ran. I don't remember exactly how long I ran. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe 20. At some point, I slipped down a small embankment and landed hard. My ankle hurt, but I forced myself up. Then I saw something through the trees. A trail marker. A real one. I almost cried when I saw it. I followed the marker. Then another. Then another. Eventually, I reached the main trail. There were other hikers ahead. I shouted for help. 2 people turned around. They looked surprised to see me. One of them asked if I was okay. I told them I'd gotten lost. I didn't mention the campsite. I didn't mention the man. Not yet. When I reached the ranger station later that afternoon, I reported what had happened. The ranger listened carefully. When I finished describing the location, he asked me to point it out on a map. I did. He stared at the map. Then he looked at me. "Are you sure?" I said yes. He asked me to describe the tent. I told him everything. Green tent, cooking stove, backpack, boots, phone, fresh food. The ranger became very quiet. Then he asked me one question. "Did you touch anything?" I said I'd picked up the phone. He sighed. He told me that area wasn't supposed to have any campsites. There hadn't been an approved campsite there in decades. I asked him if there were missing hikers. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked for the phone. I handed it to him. He examined the cracked screen. Then he walked into another room. He came back several minutes later. His expression had completely changed. He told me the phone belonged to a man who had disappeared in the park nearly 2 years earlier. The man had been hiking alone. His family had reported him missing after he failed to return home. Search teams spent several days looking for him. They never found him. Not his body, not his backpack, Not his tent. Nothing. I asked the ranger how his phone could have been sitting beside that tent. He said he didn't know. Then I asked about the man I had seen. The ranger looked at me for a long time. Finally, he said, "You're certain you saw someone?" I said yes. He nodded slowly. Then he told me something that made the entire experience even stranger. The missing hiker's family had provided investigators with photographs of him. One of those photographs showed him wearing a dark jacket, the same jacket I had seen beside the tent. I asked if they had ever found his campsite. The ranger shook his head. No. I asked if they were going to search the area I described. He said they would. A search team went out the following morning. They found nothing. No tent, no stove, no backpack, no boots, no campsite, nothing. The only thing they found was a small section of disturbed ground beneath some trees. They couldn't explain it. I left the park 2 days later. I didn't go hiking alone again for a long time. But there's one detail I've never told the ranger. Something I didn't realize until I was looking through my own photographs after I got home. Remember the picture on the phone? The photograph of the missing man standing beside the tent? I had taken a picture of that screen. I still had it on my phone. And when I zoomed in on the background, I noticed something. There was a second person standing between the trees behind him. The figure was too far away to identify, but I could see the outline of a man, and he was looking directly at the camera. I don't know who he was. I don't know whether he was real, and I still don't know why that campsite disappeared. Maybe I got lost and encountered something completely ordinary that my frightened mind turned into something more sinister. Maybe there was an explanation for the man. Maybe someone really was living out there illegally. I don't know, but I do know this. When I left that campsite, I thought someone was following me. I was right. And sometimes when I look at that photograph, I wonder whether the person following me was the same person standing behind the missing hiker 2 years earlier. Because if it was, then maybe that campsite wasn't hidden from the trail. Maybe it was hidden from everyone until someone accidentally found it. And our last story, the family that saw something between the trees. My name is Michael, and for years, my family and I had a tradition of spending a few nights camping somewhere new every summer. It started when my kids were young. My wife loved being outdoors, and I liked getting away from work for a few days. Our 2 children, Jake and Emily, weren't always excited about leaving their phones behind, but once we got there, they usually forgot about them. By the summer this happened, Jake was 16 and Emily was 13. We decided to visit a national park we'd never been to before. It was a huge park with mountains, thick forests, and several remote campgrounds that were far away from the main tourist areas. We chose one of the more isolated campgrounds because we wanted some peace and quiet. Looking back, I wish we'd stayed somewhere closer to the main road. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The campground was almost empty. There were only 3 other campsites occupied, and ours was at the very end of the campground, surrounded by trees. The ranger who checked us and was friendly. He gave us the usual instructions about food storage, wildlife, and keeping the campsite clean. Before we left the ranger station, he looked at our reservation and said something I didn't think much about at the time. "You're in Site 17? I said yes. He nodded. "Just keep your food locked up at night." I laughed and told him we would. He didn't laugh. Instead, he said, "There have been animals around that area lately." That was all. We drove to our campsite and started setting everything up. The first few hours were perfect. We cooked dinner. The kids played cards. My wife and I sat near the fire and listened to the forest. Around 10 o'clock, we heard something moving behind the tent. It was a loud rustling sound. Leaves, branches, something walking through the undergrowth. My son immediately said, "Bear." I grabbed the flashlight and stood up. We shined it toward the trees. Nothing. The sound stopped. I waited. Then I saw 2 small points of light. Eyes. They were maybe 30 feet away. I told everyone to stay calm. A few seconds later, the animal moved. It was a deer. Everyone laughed. My wife said we were being ridiculous. I agreed. The deer eventually disappeared into the woods. We went to bed. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, I woke up to another noise. This time it wasn't near the food. It was behind the tent. I could hear something slowly walking through the leaves. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Pause. I stayed still. My wife woke up. "What is it?" I whispered. "Probably a deer." Then we heard a branch snap. The sound was much louder this time. My wife sat up. We listened. Nothing. Then something moved past the tent. I could see a shadow through the thin fabric. It was tall, much taller than a deer. I reached for my flashlight. Before I could turn it on, the shadow disappeared. I woke the kids. We didn't leave the tent. We just waited. After a few minutes, everything became quiet again. The next morning, we convinced ourselves it had been an animal. Maybe a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe someone from another campsite walking around. Nothing happened during the day. We went hiking. We explored a waterfall. We came back around sunset. That's when Emily noticed something. She was standing near the picnic table when she suddenly said, "Dad." I looked at her. She pointed toward the trees. "There's someone over there." I turned. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed movement. Something was standing between two trees. It looked like a person. I shouted, "Hello." The figure disappeared behind the trees. I walked closer. My wife told me not to. I stopped. "Probably another camper," I said. But something bothered me. There wasn't another campsite in that direction. The forest behind our site went on for hundreds of yards before reaching the next road, and nobody should have been walking around there. That night, we kept the fire going longer than usual. I also made sure all the food was locked inside the bear-proof container. Around midnight, we heard it again. The movement. This time, it wasn't behind the tent. It was circling the campsite. We could hear footsteps moving through the trees. Slowly. One direction, then another. I stood beside the fire with a flashlight. "Who's there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. I shined a light between the trees. Nothing. Then, maybe 30 seconds later, I saw something. A figure, standing perfectly still. It was far enough away that I couldn't see the face. But it looked human. I shouted again, "Can I help you?" The figure didn't move. I felt a strange pressure in my chest. Something about the way it was standing didn't feel right. Then my son whispered, "Dad." I looked at him. He was staring behind me. I turned. There was another figure on the opposite side of the campsite. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. There were two of them, one in the trees to my left, one on my right. Both were standing completely still. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the nearest one. The figure moved backward into the darkness. I swung the light toward the other. It was gone too. My wife told everyone to get inside the car. We did. We sat there with the doors locked. Nobody spoke. Then something walked past the headlights. I couldn't see its face, only the outline. It crossed the road slowly and disappeared between the trees. We waited for it to come back. It didn't. Eventually, we went back into the tent. None of us slept much. The next morning, I went to the ranger station. I told the ranger we'd seen people around our campsite. He asked me what they looked like. I described them. He asked if they had approached us. I said no. Then he asked if we'd heard voices. I said no. He seemed relieved. I asked him if people sometimes wandered through that area. He said they weren't supposed to. Then I mentioned that the figures had been standing around our campsite at night. The ranger became quiet. Finally, he said, "Did they stay between the trees?" I said yes. He looked at me. "Did they ever come into the campsite?" I said no. He nodded. Then he told me something I wish he'd told me before we arrived. There had been reports of people seeing figures around that campground for years. Rangers had assumed it was wildlife, trespassers, or campers playing pranks. But some reports were different. People described seeing human-shaped figures standing deep in the woods. Always at night. Always watching the campsites. Nobody had ever gotten close enough to identify them. I asked him why the campground was still open. He shrugged. Because nobody's been hurt. That answer didn't make me feel better. We considered leaving that morning, but my wife wanted to stay one more night. She said we'd probably scared ourselves and that we shouldn't let one strange experience ruin the trip. So we stayed. That was the night everything changed. We ate dinner early. We kept the fire small. We didn't drink. We didn't joke. Everyone was watching the woods. At around 11:30, we heard something. A soft tapping sound. Top, top, top. It was coming from the trees behind the tent. I grabbed my flashlight. Then we heard another sound. Top, top, top. From the other side, Emily started crying. She said she wanted to leave. I told her we would. But before we could pack anything, something happened that I still can't explain. A voice came from the woods. It sounded like my daughter. Mom. My wife immediately looked at Emily. Emily was sitting beside her. The voice came again. Mom. It sounded exactly like her. Same voice. Same tone. Same way she pronounced the word. My wife stood up. I grabbed her arm. Don't. The voice came again. This time from farther away. Dad. My son went pale. Because it sounded like him. We were all inside the tent. Nobody outside. But the forest was using our voices. Then it started calling each of us. My wife's voice. My son's voice. My daughter's voice. Even mine. It never shouted. It just called our names from different parts of the forest. Like there were people walking around us. We stayed completely silent. Then the voices stopped. For several minutes, there was nothing. I thought maybe it was over. Then I heard footsteps. Not one person. Several. They were moving around the campsite. I looked through a small opening in the tent. At first, I saw nothing. Then I saw a figure. It was standing near the picnic table. Another stood beside the fire. Another was near the edge of the trees. I couldn't see their faces, but they were all facing the tent. I whispered to my wife, "Don't move." Then my flashlight fell over. The beam pointed through the tent wall. For a split second, I saw something outside. A face. Not an animal. Not a person I recognized. Just a pale shape between the trees. It was watching us. I immediately turned off the flashlight. Nobody moved. Then something touched the outside of the tent. The fabric pushed inward slightly. Emily grabbed my wife's arm. I knew we couldn't stay there. I whispered that we were leaving. We packed as quietly as we could. We didn't bother with the chairs. We left the cooking equipment. We didn't even properly put out the fire. We just grabbed what we could carry and ran for the car. The entire time, I expected something to come out of the trees. Nothing did. We reached the car. I unlocked it. Everyone got inside. I started the engine. Then my headlights came on, and I saw the campsite. There were footprints everywhere. Human footprints. They surrounded the tent. Some were near the fire. Some were beside the picnic table. Some were directly outside the tent. But there was something strange about them. They didn't lead toward the campsite. They led away from it. Every single set of footprints came from the woods. None of them went back. My wife noticed it too. She whispered, "Where did they go?" I didn't answer. I drove. We reached the ranger station just before sunrise. The ranger on duty came outside when he saw our car. He looked at our faces. Then he saw the camping equipment piled in the back. He didn't ask what happened. He just said, "You stayed the night." I told him everything. The voices, the figures, the footprints. He listened without interrupting. Then he asked me one question. "Did you hear them calling you from inside the tent?" I said no. He nodded. "That's good." I asked him why. He didn't answer. Instead, he told us to go home. We left the park that morning. A few weeks later, I received a phone call from the ranger. He said they had investigated our campsite. They found the footprints, at least some of them, but they couldn't explain them. There were no signs of anyone entering the campground. No vehículos. No additional campers. No tracks on the road. Nothing. The strangest part was that the footprints stopped at the tree line, as if whoever made them had simply disappeared. The ranger also told me something else. They had closed campsite 17 temporarily. I asked him if they were going to reopen it. He said, "Eventually." I never understood why. Years have passed since that trip. My children are grown now. We still go camping occasionally, but we don't camp in isolated places anymore. And we never stay anywhere that doesn't have other people nearby. Sometimes I think about that final night. Maybe there were trespassers watching us. Maybe there was some explanation that we never discovered. Maybe fear made us see things differently. I can accept all of that. What I can't explain is the voices. Because when that voice called my daughter's name from the forest, my daughter was sitting less than 3 feet away from me. And when the voice copied mine, it said something I hadn't said that night. It whispered, "Michael, come outside." I never told anyone this part before, but the voice didn't just sound like me. It sounded like me speaking from very close by, almost as if someone was standing right outside the tent, using my voice to convince my family to open the door. We didn't, and that's the only reason I believe we're still talking about it today. So if you ever find yourself camping somewhere deep in the wilderness and you hear someone you know calling to you from between the trees, don't assume they're lost. Don't assume they're hurt. And whatever you do, don't answer.